I wonder if you could name a skill or life lesson which took you many attempts to grasp. Apparently for me, I took a very long time to learn to walk. I was far too happy just sitting and watching the world go by. Even when my parents brought a walker to try and encourage me, it was used as somewhere to perch rather than actually move. Some of you who know me won't be surprised to hear that I was slightly too laid back. In the Bible, we can see that there were quite a few moments where the disciples took multiple times to grasp exactly what was going on, particularly when Jesus was performing miracles. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the feeding of the 4,000. You heard that right, 4,000, not 5,000. You may think I've got that wrong, but if you go to two of the Gospels, Matthew and Mark, you'll see that they are in fact separate events. Let's read from Mark chapter 8, verses 1 to 10. During those days, another crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me for 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, because some of them have come a long distance." His disciples answered, "But where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them?" "How many loaves do you have?" Jesus asked. 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute to other people. And they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. Afterwards, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 were present, and after he had sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Damanthua. Now that feels a little bit like deja vu if you remember the story of the feeding of the 5,000. But as well as there being a few similarities, there are also quite a few differences. So let's start with the differences. On this occasion, it is Jesus who first brings the people's needs to his disciples' attention, not the other way round. Obviously, the numbers of the story are not quite the same. And last time, in the feeding of the 5,000, the disciples felt they could safely advise people to go away and buy their own food. This time, you can almost feel the sense of panic. It's God or nothing. And here's some of the similarities. Jesus has a compassion to meet the needs of those around him and desires the involvement of his disciples. They're both set in wilderness environments, and the disciples still struggled to believe what was going on, even after hearing it in the previous chapters that Jesus had already provided these miracles for another large crowd. They struggled to have faith that Jesus could still do it again. What you see here is that even though they have witnessed several other miracles in the meantime, the disciples do not appear to have grasped that it is Jesus' power and not their own limitations that matter when it comes to solving problems. I wonder how many times we have struggled and tried to solve our own issues rather than giving them over to Jesus. Well, don't worry. Even when the disciples were doing life with Jesus and physically journeying with him, they still had moments of lack of trust and faith. In Proverbs 3 verse 5 it says, "Trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding." There is something more to this story which shows Jesus is challenging the disciples to grow their own faith even more. A key part to the feeding of the 4,000 is the place in which it happened. It happened in a place called the Decapolis, which means 10 cities in ancient Greek. The people who lived in the Decapolis were Gentiles, which meant that they were not Jewish people. The Jewish people had nothing to do with the Gentiles. They wouldn't have eaten the same thing, they wouldn't have worn the same clothes or believed the same thing. However, Jesus sees a need and meets it. We hear at the end of the story that there were 7 basketfuls of food left over, and that is significant. In the Bible, the number 7 is used frequently to symbolise completeness. So the 7 basketfuls of food left over is interpreted as a sign of God extending his relationship to include Gentiles as well as the restored Israel. It's interesting that when you read the feeding of the 4,000 and 5,000, the stories are both followed by people wanting further signs from Jesus to prove he is who he says he is. And actually, both of these times that this happens, the motivation behind the request is impure. I wonder, after seeing a miracle like that happen, if you would feel satisfied. It's almost like they're saying, that's not what I wanted to see. That doesn't quite fit my narrative. I want more. I read a quote on social media last week which said, in the Gospels, Jesus is asked 187 questions. He answers maybe 8 of them. He himself asks 307. Maybe faith isn't about certainty, but learning to ask and sit in the complexity of good questions. And so I wonder, what can we take from this today? What questions do you have about this story? And if you don't have any questions, here's some ideas of what you could be thinking about this week. I wonder where Jesus might be encouraging you to have a little bit more faith. And I wonder who Jesus might be encouraging you to feed. This might be about hospitality, it might be related to having someone over for dinner, or to input spiritually into someone's life. And lastly, let me leave you with this quote from Martin Luther King, and it says, faith is about taking the first step even when you don't see the whole staircase. Where might you need to take that first step?